On the morning they came to take the farm, my father was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, watching the county truck idle at the end of the long gravel drive. He didn't say anything, he just stood there, and the coffee went cold in his hand, and the light came through the window at that low winter angle that turns everything the color of old brass. I was 17 years old. I didn't understand yet what I was watching. I didn't understand that the silence in that kitchen was the sound of a man who had already fought every fight he knew how to fight and had run out of places to stand. If you've ever watched someone you love go quiet in a way that means something is truly finally over, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The day they took the farm, I was standing beside my father at that window, and what I felt was not grief yet. Not exactly. It was something colder and more disorienting, like the floor of the world had shifted 3 inches to the left and no one was going to acknowledge it. My name is Ruth Vance. My father's name was Daniel Vance, and he had farmed those 60 acres in the hill country east of town for 22 years, the same 60 acres his own father had cleared and fenced and coaxed into something that could sustain a family. And on a gray Thursday in November, a bank called Meridian Federal took them for $11,000 in a foreclosure judgment that had been moving through the county court system for 14 months, while my father hired and fired 2 lawyers he couldn't afford and wrote letters to offices that never wrote back. We were given until the end of the month. My father packed the way people pack when they have no destination. Slowly, with long pauses, holding objects, and setting them down. I packed faster. I was 17 and I had a kind of furious efficiency that I now understand was the only form of feeling I had access to at the time. I carried boxes to the truck. I carried the kitchen chairs. I carried the tin box my father kept on the shelf above the wood stove, which held the farm's paperwork going back to my grandfather's time. Old receipts and tax records and deed copies and correspondence with the county assessor, all of it smelling of pipe tobacco and iron, and the particular dry warmth of a room that had housed a wood stove for 30 years. I loaded the tin box into the cab of the truck without looking inside it. I didn't think about it again for 11 years. My father moved into a rented room above a hardware store in town and worked as a handyman for the better part of a decade, quiet and steady, the way he had always been. And we did not talk about the farm much because there was nothing useful to say about it. He aged in that room in a way that seemed faster than it should have been, a kind of accelerated weathering, like timber left out without treatment. I finished high school. I worked. I saved. I rented an apartment across town and built a small, manageable life that had nothing in it that I was afraid to lose. I told myself that was wisdom. I understand now it was armor. The tin box came to me on a Tuesday morning in March, 11 years after we had left the farm. My father had a stroke in January, mild. The doctors said, but enough to slow him and to scare him into the kind of practical thinking that people do when the body reminds them it is not permanent. He called me to his room above the hardware store and pointed to the shelf where the tin box sat, and said, his voice slightly thickened on the left side now, that I should take it home and go through it. He said there might be things in there that mattered. He said he had never been able to look at it himself. He said this without self-pity, just as a statement of fact, the way a man reports weather. I took the box home. I set it on my kitchen table. I made coffee. I sat down across from it the way you sit across from something you've been avoiding for a long time. And the kitchen smelled of stale coffee and the particular quiet of a winter morning. And outside the window, the sky was a flat, featureless gray. I undid the latch. The smell that came out of it was him. My grandfather, Thomas Vance, dead since I was 4, pipe tobacco and sawdust and something faintly sweet underneath, like old wood and brass. I lifted out the papers carefully, setting them in stacks. Tax records from the 70s, a copy of the original deed from 1961, receipts for equipment purchases, a folded newspaper clipping I didn't read, correspondence with the county zoning office dated 1978, and then, near the bottom, tucked inside a folded piece of brown paper that had been folded so many times the creases had gone soft, a receipt, single page, typed on a typewriter, the kind with uneven pressure so some letters are darker than others, dated September 14th, 1981, issued by Meridian Federal Bank in the amount of $11,000, marked in black ink, paid in full. Loan number 7741, B, property 60 acres, County Road 9, Vance Parcel. I sat very still. I read it again. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. Not because the document was unclear. It was perfectly clear, typewritten and official, and stamped at the bottom with the bank seal, but because of what it meant. What it meant was that my grandfather had paid off that loan in 1981, 9 years before my father took over the farm, and that when Meridian Federal had come after my father for $11,000 on that same loan number 14 months before the foreclosure, they had been collecting a debt that did not exist. That had not existed for 22 years. I sat on the cold kitchen floor. I don't remember deciding to sit down. My legs simply made the decision without consulting me. A strange choked sound came out of me, half laugh, half something else, and it echoed off the walls of the small kitchen, and then I pressed my hands flat against the linoleum and let the fullness of it move through me. 11 years 11 years of my father in that rented room, of the farm sitting under someone else's name, of the quiet that had settled over our family like weather we had decided to call permanent. $11,000, paid in full, September 14th, 1981. At the very bottom of the brown paper, behind the receipt, folded separately and addressed in my grandfather's wide, careful handwriting, a letter. My father's name on the outside, Daniel. Just Daniel. I unfolded it the way you unfold something you understand is going to change you. He had written it in 1987, 4 years before he died, and he had tucked it with the receipt as though he knew that someday the two would need to be read together. He began, "Daniel, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are managing things on your own, which I always knew you could do, even when you didn't." He wrote about the loan. He wrote that he had paid it in 1981 with money from the timber sale on the North 40, which had been a good year for timber and a hard negotiation with the buyer, and that he had kept the receipt because he didn't trust banks the way some men didn't trust weather. Not out of paranoia, he wrote, but out of experience. He wrote, "Keep this receipt. Keep it somewhere you won't throw it away by accident. Banks make mistakes. Banks also make choices. There is a difference between the two, and a piece of paper is how you tell which one you're dealing with." He wrote about the land itself. He wrote that the 60 acres had never been just income, that there was a spring on the north boundary, a clean water spring that had fed the farm since before he could remember, and that in the dry years when the neighboring parcels went brown, the spring had kept their fields and their animals alive, and that a man named Holt from the County Water Authority had come to the property twice, once in 1969 and once in 1977, asking about water rights and easements, and that he had said no both times, politely but without hesitation, because the spring was theirs and had been theirs and would be theirs. He wrote, "I never told your mother what Holt said the second time he came. He said the county would need that water eventually. He said the development they were planning east of town would require a reliable source, and that our spring was the only one in the watershed that ran year-round. I told him I appreciated his honesty and that my answer was still no. Keep that no, Daniel. Keep it the way you'd keep a deed." He wrote, "I have loved this land, and I have loved the family it fed, and I am sorry I didn't say that more plainly while I could. The land is what I had when words weren't enough." I sat on the kitchen floor with my grandfather's letter in my hands and the receipt beside it on the linoleum, and I thought about my father at the window with his cold cup of coffee, watching the county truck at the end of the drive, and I thought about 11 years of silence. And I thought about what a piece of paper can hold when the person who saved it believed that someone would eventually need it. I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Sarah Albright, and she had a small office above a dry cleaner's, and she looked at the receipt over the top of thin silver glasses and didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then she said, "This is a paid-in full receipt from the originating bank, referencing the exact loan number cited in the foreclosure judgment." She set it down carefully, like it was something fragile. "If this is authentic, and it looks authentic, then Meridian Federal foreclosed on a debt that had been satisfied 22 years before they filed." She looked up. "That's not an error. That's a wrongful foreclosure." I said I understood. She said, "Ruth, do you understand what I'm saying? This is not a technicality. This is a bank that either failed to maintain its own records for 2 decades or chose not to." She took her glasses off. "We need to find out which." The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of work. The kind that happens in fluorescent-lit offices and overhauled music and in county record rooms that smell of cold concrete and old paper. Sarah filed a records request with Meridian Federal. The bank's response came back in 3 weeks. A letter from their legal department, written in the careful, preemptive language of institutions that know they are in trouble, acknowledging that loan number 7741B showed a payment record that their foreclosure team had failed to cross-reference at the time of filing. They used the word oversight 4 times. They did not use the word apology. I drove out to see my father on a Saturday morning. He was sitting in the chair by the window of the room above the hardware store, and the light came through the window at that same low winter angle, and he looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I just saw him differently now that I understood what had been taken. I sat down across from him and I put the receipt on the table between us. He looked at it. He picked it up. He held it the way he had held that cold coffee cup, like something he wasn't sure was real. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked out the window and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick and careful, and he said, "My father always said keep the paperwork." I said, "He was right." My father looked at the receipt again, and then at me, and he said quietly, "I thought I'd failed it." He meant the land. I said, "You didn't fail it. They took it." Those are different things. George at the hardware store below my father's room turned out to have known my grandfather and to have known the farm, and when I stopped in for a padlock one afternoon and mentioned what we had found, he set the padlock on the counter and looked at me for a moment and said, "Your grandfather fought the county on that water twice." "Did you know that?" I said I was beginning to. He said, "Smart man, stubborn as a fence post and twice as useful." He rang up the padlock and gave me a look that was not quite a smile, but was something in that neighborhood. He said, "Don't let them tell you the receipt's not enough. It's enough." He slid the bag across the counter. "It's more than enough." Sarah filed suit on a Wednesday in April. The claim was wrongful foreclosure, unjust enrichment, and negligence in loan record maintenance. Meridian Federal's response arrived through their attorneys, a firm downtown with a lobby that had pale furniture and people who walked quickly. Within 2 weeks, they requested a meeting. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a glass building, and it had a view of the city that was meant to be impressive. And was. 2 men in expensive suits sat across the table, one charcoal gray, one navy, and a woman with the precise manner of someone who had managed a great many uncomfortable meetings sat at the end. They spoke warmly about resolution and about their commitment to correcting historical record-keeping deficiencies, and about their genuine desire to make this right for our family. The charcoal suit slid a document across the table. A settlement offer, $75,000, and a formal letter of apology. It was a serious number. It was also, Sarah had told me in the elevator, approximately what the farm's assessed value had been at the time of foreclosure. Nothing more. I thought about the spring on the north boundary that ran clean through the dry years. I thought about Holt, from the county water authority, coming to the property twice and being told no, twice by a man who understood the difference between value and price. I thought about my grandfather sitting down to write a letter to a son he would not live to see through his hardest years, and tucking a receipt inside a brown paper fold because he did not trust banks the way some men don't trust weather. I thought about my father at the window with his cold coffee watching them take what was his. I said no. The charcoal suit's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. A small recalculation visible for just a moment. I said that we were not there to settle for assessed value. I said that the farm had been wrongfully taken 11 years ago, and that during those 11 years the property had appreciated, the water rights had become relevant to the county's Eastern Development Plan, and that a formal acknowledgement of wrongful foreclosure created liability that extended well beyond the original $11,000. I said that what I was prepared to accept was the return of the property deed, a settlement equal to 11 years of lost agricultural income calculated at fair market rates, a formal legal acknowledgement of the wrongful foreclosure filed with the county court, and a contribution to a county farmland preservation trust in the amount of $50,000 held in perpetuity. Sarah did not look at me. She was already writing. The charcoal suit looked at the navy suit. The woman at the end of the table looked at her hands. No one spoke for a long time. They agreed. Not that afternoon. It took 6 more weeks of back and forth, of numbers and language and the careful scaffolding of legal documents, but they agreed to every provision. The deed was transferred back into the Vance name. The settlement covered 11 years of income loss. The farmland trust was established. The formal acknowledgement was filed with the county court on a Tuesday morning, and Sarah called me when it was done and said only, "It's recorded." I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and looked out the window at the gray spring sky and let it settle over me. Slowly, the way warmth comes back into a room after a long winter. I drove my father out to the farm on a Saturday in May. He hadn't been back in 11 years. He sat in the passenger seat of my truck and looked out the window as the city thinned around us and the road curved east into the hills. And he didn't say much, just watched the trees thicken and the land open up. And when I turned onto County Road 9 and the gravel started under the tires, he put his hand on the doorframe and held it there. We parked at the end of the drive. He got out slowly. He stood in the tall grass at the edge of the field and looked at the farmhouse, which needed work but was standing, and at the north fence line, and at the sky above the hill. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "The spring's still running." He had checked before we came. It was. I said, "I know." He turned and looked at me, and his eyes were wet at the corners, and he said, "Your grandfather knew." I said, "He knew." We walked the boundary together that afternoon, my father and I following the fence line the way he must have walked it 1,000 times before, through the tall grass and along the creek and up the hill to the north edge where the oaks came right up to the wire. He moved slowly, but he moved like a man on his own land, which is a different thing entirely from any other way of moving. At the top of the hill, he stopped and looked out over the 60 acres, and the light was long and gold in the late afternoon, and the smoke from the neighbor's chimney was going straight up into still air, and the whole thing smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and the particular sweetness of late spring in the hill country. He said, "I thought it was gone." I said it was, and now it isn't. He nodded, once, slowly, the way men of his generation nod when something is simply true, and there is nothing useful to add. I stand at the north fence line sometimes now, where the spring comes up through the ground and runs clear over the flat stones my grandfather laid to keep the bank from washing. And I think about a receipt typed on a typewriter in September of 1981 and folded inside brown paper and kept for reasons that the man who kept it never fully explained. I think about the specific kind of faith that is required to keep a piece of paper for 6 years without knowing if it will ever matter. I think about what it means to believe without proof that someone will eventually need what you have saved. The most valuable things are sometimes hidden in plain sight, in a tin box on a shelf, in a fold of brown paper and a handwriting that smells of pipe tobacco and iron. They wait for someone patient enough to go looking and brave enough to know what they're holding once they find it. If you've ever been told that something was gone, that a door was closed, that what belonged to you was simply no longer yours, I want you to say something in the comments. Tell me, what is the thing someone told you was finished that turned out not to be? Tell me about the receipt you almost didn't keep. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.